in week 0 and week 1, if you recall, Florida State and Georgia Tech got together and had a 5 million view audience, which Mike Norvell is not too happy to have presented his football team in the beginning of the catastrophe that was Florida State football this past year. That was the 5th rated game of week 0 and 1, although there was a big advantage there in which FSU and Georgia Tech were not competing against anyone. Largely, most of these games were not competed against, like USC and LSU. Yes, it got a huge number, but consider nobody else was playing on Sunday night to compete against that game. So again, locking in on the ACC, we've got the numbers 3, 4, and 5 games of the week with Clemson involved against Georgia at 7.5 million views on ABC. Miami and Florida played part of that triple header to 6.5 million folks, roughly. So we see Clemson, Georgia, noon on ABC. What does this tell us? Something, maybe, that 1.2 million people less watched a more competitive football game after watching Georgia shellac Clemson 31-3. 1.2 million people less on the same network. Next time slot, which may be a better time slot, that could be argued, Miami and Florida. Still a nice number at 6.3 million. The next weekend, Florida State. Florida State has locked down prime time in week 0 and week 1 in recent years. They've had games against Alabama, Notre Dame, here against Boston College, Virginia Tech, and others. Of course, back-to-back years against LSU. So that's a good marketing ploy by Florida State and the ACC. However, it doesn't work out too well when you look completely atrocious. On this Monday night, it was Boston College and Florida State at 4.44 million. And elsewhere in the ACC, there was a Thursday night game, North Carolina, Minnesota on Fox, 1.8 million, which was trounced by the Colorado game against North Dakota State. So that was all about Deion Sanders drawing a crowd, because Colorado and North Dakota State would not outdraw North Carolina and Minnesota normally. And then Stanford, new to the ACC, taking on TCU on a Friday night on ESPN, got 1.5 million views. Virginia Tech and Vandy turned out to be a really good game, and an upset for Vandy drew just under 1.5 million on ESPN at noon. And I believe that is it for the ACC. I believe. No, we got Pitt taking on Kent State. 82,000 people decided to check that out. An average of 82,000. So more than 82,000 people actually checked out Pitt at Kent State at some point, but that was the average viewership on ESPNU. Let's go to week 2. There's week 2. And the ACC chimes in with the number 4 game. NC State, Tennessee. The Wolfpack got shellacked by 41 points. Just under 3 million people watched that game on ABC. Then we have to go down quite a bit to find the next ACC team that shows up. That's Cal and Auburn on ESPN2. Just over 1 million people watched it. And I'm sure Cal brought about 10% of that crowd. We also have, new to the ACC, of course, this past year, SMU almost won the conference. Just under 1 million people watched SMU and BYU, which turned out to be one of the most talked about games of the year because of the playoff implications. That was on a Friday night. 917,000 people watched it. Duke and Northwestern got together on FS1, 514,000 average viewership. Virginia Wake on ESPN2 at 358K. Pitt Cincinnati at 304 on ESPN2. And that is it for week 2 in the ACC. And again, we're going to summarize this a little bit better for the clip that's going to be released on Thursday morning. Week 3 in the ACC TV ratings. Nobody in the 1 position, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Where does the ACC show up? When they do, they show up against Memphis. Florida State, Memphis, noon game on ESPN, 1.59 million. A lot of these TV ratings not delivering well for the ACC here. When you consider no ACC teams in the top 8 games, then it's Florida State against Memphis, which is a far cry, of course, from Georgia, Kentucky, and Alabama, Wisconsin. Elsewhere in the ACC, West Virginia and Pitt. Now, this shows you the power of the network and the time slot. West Virginia and Pitt played the year before on a Thursday night opening weekend on ESPN on a Thursday night with only one game in competition. And over 3.5 million people watched that game. 1 year later, West Virginia and Pitt played another game down to the wire, 1.1 million, a third of the audience, because it was ESPN2. And there was competition at 3:30 in the afternoon. Other games coming from the ACC in week 2 involve Cal and San Diego State on ESPN, just under 1,938,000. And that's about what an ESPN game usually gets in the late window. Then on Saturday, we've got Ole Miss and Wake, 419,000 on CW. And that is it for week 3. On to week 4. In the ACC, nobody in the top 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 positions. The top-rated ACC game, NC State and Clemson, just under 2 million on ABC. What this is starting to show me, since we did the Big 12 on Tuesday, is that the difference between the ACC and the Big 12 is Deion Sanders. Colorado drew crowds of plus 6 million, plus 4 million 4 times, regularly in the 3.5 million range. And we're seeing even Clemson, NC State at under 2 million. Elsewhere from the ACC, Stanford, Syracuse. That was a Friday night game. That was a very entertaining game where Stanford got a walk-off field goal due to Fran Brown's incompetence. 1.37 million on ESPN. Miami and South Florida. That was a Saturday night game on ESPN at 1.25 million. And I'm sure ESPN was not real pleased to schedule Miami and South Florida on a Saturday night, because the Saturday night games on ESPN do way more than 1.2 million typically. Cal, Florida State, ESPN2, 887,000. Georgia Tech, Louisville. That was a good ball game on ESPN2, 782,000. And on down the list, SMU brought in a paltry 322,000 along with TCU on the CW. Duke and Middle Tennessee. I'm sure you all were captivated by this one. Duke and Middle Tennessee, 53,000 average viewership on ESPNU for a 3:30 kick. Week 5, where's the ACC going to show up? Number 1. Where is the number 1 ACC game? It was the 6th rated game of the week. Virginia Tech and Miami, the one that went down to the wire. Virginia Tech threw the Hail Mary that almost was called a touchdown and was not. And they went to replay. 3.26 million for a Friday night on ESPN. Next up, Stanford Clemson blowout. Exactly 1 million people. Exactly 1 million people. Average viewership for that one on ESPN. We have Duke and North Carolina, not basketball, football, 521,000 on ESPN2. NC State against NIU, 427,000 on the CW. Next up from the ACC, anybody else? No one else. On to week 6. Will the ACC have one ratings win during this season? I have to think not. Clemson, Florida State, Miami, Florida State would be the 2 shots. the two most obvious shots. Those aren't going to come close. So again, we got to go down the list to find the ACC. They are not in the top 6, 7. There they are. Miami and Cal. That was a late night game on ESPN. Went down to the wire. Miami pulled it out. They were down 35-10. 1.29 million, 1.92 million watched it on ESPN. There's the Clemson-Florida State game, which was one of the worst Clemson-Florida State games in recent memory. Florida State, of course, at this point had proven to be awful. 1.4 million on ESPN on a Saturday night. That was a Saturday night primetime ESPN game. 1.4 million. SMU Louisville. They played at noon. That was a good ball game. 1.4 million ESPN. Syracuse, UNLV, that was a Friday night game on FS1. That was a good ball game, 44-41 overtime game. 698,000 watched it. Pitt, North Carolina, ESPN2, 645K. Wake, NC State, that reeks of CW, 446 in week 7. Topped by Ohio State, Oregon at 9.6 million. Where's the ACC show up? 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 11th rated game of the week is the top ACC game. Only 1.3 million people watch Clemson and Wake Forest. Noon ESPN. Next up, Cal and Pitt, 741 ESPN. Georgia Tech and North Carolina on the CW, 541,000. Anyone else from the ACC? No, we move on to week 8. Where's the ACC going to show up? The third rated game of the week. This would be the ACC's best showing. And this may turn out to be the highest rated game for the ACC all season, which is a bad showing because they should have a game show up at 5 million. They did last year when Florida State was good. Miami and Louisville, the third highest rated game of the week, 4.07 million on ABC. Next up, Georgia Tech in a game against Notre Dame at 1.59 million on ESPN. Florida State and Duke at 1.26 million. Boston College, Virginia Tech. That was a Thursday night game on ESPN at 712,000. And that is it for the ACC. Week 8. Week 9, topped by Ohio State, Nebraska. The ACC shows up at the 14th rated game of the week. So think about that. There's about 35 games that get rated every week. And in this particular week, the SEC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12 as well comprise the 13 highest rated games of the week. The ACC doesn't show up until number 14. Florida State, Miami, 1.5 million. That's a prime time game on ESPN. So this game did not get buried in any way. Syracuse and Pitt. That was the Kyle McCord 5-pick game on a Thursday night, 948,000 on ESPN, followed closely by Louisville, Boston College, 879. Elsewhere, North Carolina, Virginia, that was a noon game on the CW at 398,000. Cal shows up against Oregon State. 183,000 people watching that game on a Saturday afternoon on ESPN2. That's a lousy number. On to week 9. On to week 10. Topped by Ohio State, Penn State at 9.77 million. And where does the ACC show up? Game number 5 with Duke and Miami. I watched that game. 1.96 million on ABC. Clemson, Louisville. That was a primetime game on ESPN at 1.4 million. Elsewhere in the ACC, anybody. Is that it for the entire conference for week 10? So everyone had a bye week, and then there was probably a triple header on the ACC network, which do not show up. Unfortunately, we do not have SEC network and ACC network numbers. Week 11, topped by Bama, LSU, and Georgia Ole Miss. So the SEC dominated the airwaves in week 11. And the ACC shows up with its best showing. Miami, Georgia Tech, 3.46 million. That's a noon game on ESPN. And then after that, Clemson, Virginia Tech, that was a 3:30 game on ESPN at 1.44 million. So there's a direct comparison to a certain extent there. Miami and Georgia Tech play on ESPN, 3.5 million people watch it. Then the next game's Clemson, Virginia Tech. Pretty similar brands. Comparing Clemson, Miami, and Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech, and 2 million less people watch that game. For one thing, again, these ACC network triple headers are carving into the listings here. Tennessee, Georgia, just under 10 million folks watched it on average. The ACC comes in with Virginia against Notre Dame, under 2 million on NBC. Clemson, Pitt, 1.85 million, ESPN noon game. Boston College and SMU, 957,000 on ESPN, Saturday at 3:30 Eastern. Syracuse and Cal, that was on the CW, 298. And that's it for the ACC in week 12. Week 13, topped by Ohio State, Indiana. And the ACC finally shows up. Number 13, Wake Forest and Miami. Not even 1 million people. Wow. NC State, Georgia Tech at 897,000 on ESPN. SMU, Virginia, 262. Ouch. That was a blowout, too. Just an awful game. Pitt, Louisville, 240,000 people on ESPN2. That's a terrible showing for ESPN2. And on to the final regular season week. And, of course, on this particular weekend, a lot of Thursday and Friday games with Thanksgiving. And Georgia Tech, I don't know that we can give them too much credit for this one. Georgia Tech, 8.47 million on a Friday night. And, of course, 8 overtimes. Tremendous football game. After that, not much. Clemson, South Carolina, 2.4 million at noon, ESPN. Miami, Syracuse, 2.1 million, ESPN. Florida State, ESPN2, primetime, Florida State, 1.37 million. And that is it for the regular season. Championship weekend. I noted this on Tuesday. I think it's pretty important that there's a direct correlation here. Clemson, SMU, the ACC championship game, drawing just under 6 million views, just about 1 million views less as a tremendous game. That was a 17-point comeback by SMU in the fourth quarter to get to a final 56-yard field goal to win the game. Did not stay with Arizona State and Iowa State that turned out to be a blowout in the third quarter. Not a good look for the ACC there. Other bowl games and playoff games. No, these are the largest audiences of the season. And this must be before the college football playoff. And the ACC is not going to show up forever in this. Look at this. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. Okay, the 17th highest rated game of the season involved an ACC team. Georgia Tech, Georgia, 8.5 million. Again, can we really give the ACC much credit for that. And then Clemson and Georgia down the list at 7.6 million on ABC. Bowl games. Clemson against Texas. That had the unfortunate situation of competing against the NFL and getting a bit trounced. Still 8.9 million people watched it. SMU and Penn State was the lowest rated playoff game at 6.6 million. And again, they had to compete against the NFL. Elsewhere in the ACC, Cal and UNLV at 1.48 million. And then there were other postseason games the next weekend. And this was the best showing by the ACC, period. Almost as good as the playoff game. About 2 million less. But still, considering the stakes, Miami and Iowa State at 6.79 million on ABC. There you see Boston College against Nebraska, 4.1 million. Georgia Tech, over 4 million on ESPN. So like I say it all the time, when these bowl games are discounted and discarded, that more people are watching these teams during bowl play. Nobody watched Syracuse to the extent of almost 3 million viewers until they played a bowl game against Washington State on Fox. Pitt and Toledo, 2.5 million ESPN game. And NC State and East Carolina, they were under 1 million on the Military Bowl. And that is it for the ACC.